Good afternoon. Today we will conclude our class with our final lecture, and this will be on a book by E.F. Schumacher called A Guide for the Perplexed. So, unfortunately, given the pace of the class, we won't be able to get through all the book, and I did give you a good chunk to read for this week. Um, so, what I hope to do is sort of break it down by chapter and just kind of hit the high points for you, what I'm going to be sort of looking for you to be able to understand, particularly when you get to your final exam, which you'll be taking later this week and over the weekend. So I want to make sure that you're in a good spot for that. If you have any questions about the lecture or anything you didn't understand, you can certainly email me and be more than happy to help you. But what I hope to do is just kind of go through chapter by chapter, sort of hit the high points. And then if you have any questions on that, then you can get with me and I'd be more than happy to answer these. Um, well, this is a wonderful little book insofar as I think after all the other stuff that you've read this semester, this book is laid out in a very sort of methodical fashion, which isn't surprising when you consider that E.F. Schumacher originally was an economist. He was part of that World War II generation, and he was a German guy. He actually got out of Germany when the whole World War II stuff happened. So he wasn't a member of the Nazi Party or anything like that. So he was in Great Britain studying economics. And he studied under some pretty heavy hitters. I think he studied under Keynes and maybe Galbraith. Um, anyway, so when the war was over, though, and the Third Reich had been defeated, he went back to his native Germany to kind of help rebuild the country. And he was a member of the coal board there, which was kind of a big industrial sort of um, entity. It was not a private run, I believe it was state run. And so he was sort of taking on that uh, task after the war was over. However, at some point, Schumacher began sort of, and even when he was a younger man, he wasn't necessarily a religious person. In fact, he may have even, I believe, been an atheist. And at some point, he started studying a lot of uh, religions of the world. Particularly, he was very interested in Buddhism, but his interest in religions ranged from the great monotheistic religions in the West, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, but then also just sort of what we would call indigenous religions. So these might be the religions of indigenous peoples to the Americas or to Africa and to other places like this. And and his view was, as if you've started reading the book, is that uh, he, being a man of math and science, and he appreciated that, he sort of felt that the world had become, particularly the Western world, had become sort of hyper focused on that and had lost a certain sort of balance. And so in this book, he's kind of talking, uh, writing for young people or for anyone really who sort of looks at the world and feels that maybe the deeper questions they have about it aren't really being addressed in a satisfactory manner. Certainly, teachers, professors, parents, any sort of adult figure maybe in our life means well and wants to help us. But sometimes maybe the deeper questions that we have about things, sometimes we feel are sort of left unaddressed. And so that's what he's taking place, and that's what he's going to be doing here in this book. So I guess we'll just go ahead and start with chapter one. which in this edition, now I did send, I think, this out online. There's a link to it. Uh, but you can start reading on page 1. But he starts talking about philosophical maps. And generally, we know what a map is, right? I think we've used it. I mean, we may not use the paper maps that I was much more familiar with probably when I was a lot of your age and what have you. But maps kind of tell us where we are. And if we're lost, it can kind of direct us to where we need to go. And usually we have a destination. We want to arrive somewhere. We might not necessarily be sure of how to get there. Well, he likens our life in that sort of fashion. Uh, Human beings are sort of on a journey, and most of what we've been studying this semester has been asking, what is the good? What should human beings do with their life? Okay, because in philosophy, traditionally, in all cultures, it doesn't matter where you are. Uh, whether you are in, kind of the Western, Judeo Christian sort of culture, or if you were any of the great Eastern cultures of the East, Taoism, Hinduism, Jainism, Shintoism, if you're any of the great indigenous religions, the Aborigines that you find in Australia, or the peoples of North and South America or Africa, all people, no matter where they are, particularly if we just think about people before we reach the modern world, everyone sort of has thought about these, what are called perennial questions. Who am I? Why am I here? How should I live? And what's after death? Okay. And traditionally, now these are questions every culture and every person is sort of asked in some form or fashion. Most of these questions would have usually been answered through the religious traditions of that particular culture. And those sometimes those answers came in the form of myths or stories, or sometimes works of art. But man sort of feels like that he has a task in trying to be a human person, feels like they have a task to become something more than what they are. The problem is that sometimes we're not really sure how to get there. So he talks about that there are these things called philosophical maps. And the philosophical maps are just basically that. They are to be used to help us to find our way through life. Okay? And in the beginning, in chapter 1, he kind of gives a piece of advice that actually comes from a philosopher from the Middle Ages. Uh, and it's really not unique to him, but it's an idea that an error in the beginning is an error indeed. And what that means is that if you start off wrong, no matter, start off wrongly, no matter how diligent you are, how smart you are, um, how maybe uh, sincere you are, that if your beginning is not quite right, you're more than likely going to miss your destination or the end, right? So I remember years ago listening to a man who was an astronaut, and he's kind of talked about, when you were taken into space, given the great distance that you had to travel, if you were just a few degrees off in your calculations of where you were going, you could wind up tens of thousands of miles off course. Just a tiny error in calculation at the beginning could end with you being very, very, very far away from where you ever intended to go. So he says that, and it's his contention that modern human beings, and when he's talking about modern human beings, he's kind of, the modern period for him that he's really kind of focusing on is probably one that would have begun in the 16th century with Descartes. Excuse me, kind of blacked out on us. And so if you look on page 4, if we're talking about sort of beginning or starting wrongly in terms of our philosophical map, if we're asking, who am I? Why am I here? How should I live? And after death, what is there, right? Well, he says that there is maps that have been produced in the modern era. And if you're looking at the bottom of page 4, he says the maps produced by, and this is an important term, modern materialistic scientism leave all the questions that really matter unanswered. And more than that, they deny the validity of those questions. So in other words, the question I just said, who am I? Like really, who am I as a human being? What can I expect to achieve out of life? What should my goals be? Okay. Why am I here? I mean, certainly you're sitting in this class or this online class because you want to further your education. And if we're all being honest, it's to help move you along closer to whatever maybe career or vocational goal that you may have. But at the end of the day, I think you're all aware too that you want to have something more of your life. You want something more out of life than just a good job, right? Because it's kind of like the old saying that no one on their deathbed says, darn, I wish I could have spent another day at the office. Very few people do that, right? Well, he says, and then certainly questions like after death and everything like that, materialistic scientism are questions that leave, or is a philosophical map or a way of thinking about the world that leave those questions unanswered, and in fact would say those questions are nonsensical. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, by materialistic, we're basically saying that the person who's a materialist basically has the view that there is nothing more to the world than just pure brute matter. Even if you take a brilliant athlete like, Serena Williams, or, maybe a musician like Beethoven or Count Basie or any of these individuals, yes, they may have accomplished great things, but when you get right down to it, all they are just complexes of chemicals and electrical circuitry, and that's about all there is to a human being, regardless of maybe the very amazing things that they might be capable of. So materialism, there's nothing beyond this. So if we were looking at a philosopher like Nietzsche, Nietzsche would very much be a materialist, okay? Because Nietzsche did not believe in a transcendental being like God. And what we mean by a transcendental being, we mean a being who is beyond space and time and matter, okay? That he's outside of that. Well, for most people, that's just inconceivable, all right? And so Nietzsche would be a materialist in that way. Now, by scientism, we just basically mean that if materialism just says the only thing that exists is matter, that's it. There's no spiritual realm, there's no higher dimension, there's no heaven, there's no transcendental world of being or anything like that. Scientism would just say, and the only way to know if the only thing that exists is just matter, the only way to really know this is through science, the physical science. So chemistry, biology, botany, physics. But when we get right down to it, the thing that most people would say that is most probably appropriate in studying things scientifically would be mathematics, okay, particularly applied math, All right. So that's what he means by scientific uh, materialism. And he says that basically that this has been our sort of philosophical map in the Western world, excuse me, since probably the time of Descartes. All right. Now, let me just say something really quickly. Schumacher is not trying to deny the importance of matter or the material world, and he's certainly not uh, speaking against the validity and the necessity of science. Okay. Here, what we're talking about is an overemphasis on a certain aspect of reality and a certain way of knowing that reality that excludes maybe other things that exist in the world. So, therefore, if you have a map and maybe the map shows, it's a road and it shows you everything that's going on, the highways and other highways feeding it in. And then at some point, the map doesn't show you that there's this massive river where there was a bridge, but the bridge has been washed out. Okay. Or there's this map and, oh, it looks like easy going. And then all of a sudden, there's this tremendous mountain in your way. And it just doesn't show it. Well, that would be a problem because now there's this aspect of my journey that's actually very important that's being completely left out of the picture. And so the goal for Schumacher, and really I'll be honest with you, the goal in any good philosophy is to make a map that can capture the fullness of reality. Now, no map is going to be absolutely perfect, but some maps are better than others. So, in other words, the map that Adolf Hitler used to understand the world and the map that maybe, Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi used to understand the world, if we're all being, and Schumacher would say, if we're being honest, Gandhi and MLK had a superior map because it captured more of the way the world actually was. The map that Adolf Hitler had was absolutely, not only did it leave certain things out, but it falsified uh, things about reality as well. So the point here is that all maps are not created equal. And some maps are better than others, right? And Schumacher would probably hope that most people could agree that if you had to follow the philosophical map of MLK or you had the philosophical map of Adolf Hitler, hopefully most people, if they were using their thinking well and were sort of right within themselves, could see that MLK is the better way to go, right? So he talks about sort of poor map makers in this chapter, this first chapter. I'll just kind of hit the high points on some of these. On page 9, he talks about Descartes. And Descartes usually is the person who is considered the father of sort of modern philosophy, okay, at least in the West, right? And so, and Descartes is a very brilliant man. I mean, the guy has a dream one night, and that ends up becoming calculus. So, I mean, there are some important things that he did. But according to Schumacher, there's some things that he did because of his narrowed vision actually has had some detrimental effects on Western civilization. So here, Descartes would just say, this is on page 9, and I'm just kind of summarizing this, but you can read it for yourself. It says, real objects of knowledge must be beyond doubt. Okay, and this is achieved through mathematics and geometry. So, in other words, unless you can know something with 100% certainty, beyond all doubt, and you reach that conclusion through math or geometry, then unless you've done that, whatever else it is probably not worth knowing. Now, if that's the case, well, then there's a whole lot of things that sort of look like they drop out of our world. Friendship. I have friends, and I hope that my friendship with these people will continue. But there's a certain sense in which if I were to try to have mathematical certainty on our friendship, that would be sort of odd, right? And then two, that's the wrong way to even approach friendship. That's not the way you make a friend, right? So then, on the next page on 8, on page 10, he talks about another guy named Francis Bacon, who's usually kind of considered the father sort of modern Western science. Okay, it's not like they didn't start doing science until Francis Bacon, right? I mean, people have been doing science. I mean, if you go to the Great Pyramids of Giza, I mean, that's a high level of scientific and mathematical sophistication, all right? And that was, 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. But he's the one that's usually considered like the modern sort of scientific method and stuff. But he would say that the only knowledge that is desirable is that which gives us power over nature. Okay, unless it gives me some sort of power over nature to do something, the knowledge is not necessarily worthwhile. Now, in a little bit, we're going to kind of look at this when we get to kind of the end of our last chapter that we're going to be reading and kind of see if that's actually the case. Then he brings up Kant. So we studied Kant. Now, we didn't really study Kant's sort of views of reality. We looked a little bit on his ethical views, and maybe you could kind of tease out a hint the way he would look at the world. But Kant was very influenced by Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, who was the physicist, great physicist from England. And he says, Kant makes the operation of reason compatible with and dependent upon Newtonian physics. So for him, if things couldn't be empirically verified or were sort of empirically subject to investigation, then those sorts of things were not necessarily, they were things that just couldn't be known, right? And then the last person he looks at is Mill. And Mill, he said, is that the work or life is the work for happiness, where happiness is just understood as pleasure. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasure, and Mill would certainly talk about higher pleasures, but this Schumacher is going to say that even if you're talking about higher pleasures, it may be that we pursue something and the pleasure is not really the aim. It just sort of comes along with whatever it is we're studying. Okay. So at this point, we'll go ahead and we'll start kind of just clipping through these chapters. Let's try to spend about 1, 2, 3, 4. So spend about 10 minutes or so, hopefully, on each one. And so we can kind of get a rough idea of where they're going. Okay. But the first chapter he starts off with is this idea of levels of being. Okay. Levels of being. And by levels of being, he's talking about levels of existence, of how things exist in the world. Okay. Now, so we start off with, and these are the levels. We start off with what he calls mineral, but I think it would probably be even better if you just put matter. Just, whatever helps you best. For me, matter kind of works a little better, but it would mean the same thing, mineral or matter. Okay. And then there is the level of being of plants. Okay. And then there's the level of being of animals. And then there's the level of being of humans. Okay. Human beings. Now, this is sometimes in the Western world, this would have been called usually the great chain of being. Okay. And then beyond this, above this level, would be sort of like the transcendental world or God. Okay. Being itself. All of these are beings. Okay. Being itself would be like God. Okay. And if you're trying to say, well, what's the difference between something that has that something that's a, you know, something that are beings versus something that is being itself? Well, if I were to say the book has being, has existence, well, that would kind of make sense because the book does have existence. But here's the thing. It could be that at some point this book would not have existence. It would go out of existence. So, somehow I lose the book, or, the book is burned up. Okay. The book catches on fire and is reduced to ash. In that sense, the book would not have existence as a book anymore. So we can understand if we say the book has existence. But then our language picks up on something a little different when we say, suppose if I were to say the book is existence. Well, now if you can, hopefully you could see the difference. I would be saying that anything that existed and everything that existed would have to exist in the manner of this book, which is absurd. This book has existence. It's a part of existence, but it's not existence itself. Why? Because it's contingent. It doesn't last, right? Whereas existence itself, traditionally from philosophers, whether they're from the East or the West, they traditionally say that this being is beyond sort of space and time, okay? So these are levels of existence. So we go from the lower to the higher. Now, real quickly, I want to make sure. So this is kind of a hierarchic structure of being. Now, I do want to say something that I think is important. When we say something is higher on this level of being, we are not saying that the thing lower at the lower end is absolutely unimportant or bad or wrong or evil. That's not what we're saying. Now, there have been some philosophers who might say this at different points, and Nietzsche is one of those philosophers who would be very much against that, right? I mean, he thinks that that's the problem with a lot of philosophers. They just kind of take the physical world and say it's absolutely bad. It's got to be something we got to get beyond. The only thing that's important is this transcendental world. And then Nietzsche says, well, that causes us to forget the world that we're actually in. And to that extent, Nietzsche is probably correct in critiquing those views of those philosophers. That is not Schumacher's view that the physical world is bad, okay? And it's not really the view of this philosophical tradition that he's really kind of coming out of, which begins, at least in the West, with someone like, Socrates and Plato. There's a difference between these levels of being, okay? But they're all sort of interdependent on one another. Okay, so if we look at this, and I think he does something that's fairly clever, he helps us understand how these levels of being work out if we were to put them in sort of in the form of an equation. So if we took mineral and we just made the variable for mineral M, so we just have M, And here, matter, at this point, matter is inanimate. Okay, it's inanimate. So in other words, there's no life. All right, it's lifeless. Does that mean it's bad? No, it's just not alive. Okay. But then if we move up, because look, we can look at the world and say, hey, there are other things in this world than just rocks and water and lava, okay, and dirt. All right. I'm looking out, I could look out my window right now and see a live oak. Well, the live oak is a plant, and the plant has this variable x. And this variable x is, in a certain sense, very mysterious because this variable x stands for life, or it is animate. And by animate, that comes from the Latin word anima, which means soul. So, and by soul, at this point, we don't mean soul in the sense of what we might think of in maybe a religious sort of context. We mean soul as a principle of vitality, the thing that makes the thing a living being. Okay? So, right here, there is a big discontinuity between that which is not living to that which does live. Okay? But now here's the thing. This is very important. The living things that we know of, I mean, I think it would be better to be alive than not alive. Most people would say that, okay? And obviously sometimes people get in some very tragic situations and you can kind of maybe feel like that, like you don't want to go on or something. But all things being equal, most people would say, if I could have things the way I would like them to be, if I could have security and friendship and love and fulfillment, I would like to be alive. Well, here's the thing. There is no life that we know of, that we see on our day-to-day existence, that is without matter. Okay? So if we just take the human body is made up of, as if you've taken your anatomy and physiology, because I know a lot of you in this class are probably going to be nursing majors or going into some kind of medical field. You know that the body, one of the largest constituents of our body, material constituents, is water. Okay? Even the tree out there has a degree of water in it as well. And there's also in my body trace element. I've got calcium going on. I've got some iron. There's some zinc. There's some copper. There's even, to be quite honest with you, it's kind of odd, but there's something in me. It's a very, very, very trace element called montmorillonite, which is one of the basic sort of constituents in clay. So really, there's kind of some dirt in me too. And yet, you and I are more than dirt, right? So, but there is this mysterious sort of movement from that which is inanimate to animate. And Schumacher makes this sort of interesting observation that most people, your biologists, your physiologists, your botanists, your zoologists, your ornithology, ichthyology, people that study fish, everything. Most people study the sort of the carrier of life, which means the biological substrate, the body, the mechanism, the thing that's bearing life. But they don't necessarily study the mysterious element of life itself. Now, certainly, things that are living, there are electrical impulses in that, okay? So we could say, well, but so if you went, oh, well, there's electrical impulses because, the nervous system runs by that. Electricity is life. Well, no, not really, because lightning is not alive. So the question becomes, really, where does this and what is this? Now, he doesn't try to answer it, really. In some ways, most of the great religions of the world, regardless of where you would have come from, would say that there is something inherently mysterious about this. In some ways, it sort of transcends man's ability or a human being's ability to really see and explain what that is. Okay? Well, then he says, then we move up from, we have mineral plus life, that gives me plants. But then we have, if we move up, there's certainly other things than plants out there. They're animals. And you and if we're just looking at sort of taxonomy and species and stuff, we are certainly animals. We're a certain type of animal. We're mammals, right? But animals have, not only are they made of minerals, okay, they've got water in them. If they have bones, they have calcium. They probably have these other trace elements too, iron, because, your blood's got iron and stuff like that. Well, they certainly are alive, okay. But the other thing they have is they have kind of consciousness. So they're aware. They have awareness of their surroundings in the way that the plant does not. Okay, and not only that, but with this consciousness comes a sort of two degrees. There is this sort of movement, locomotion. Okay, and then finally we get to level Z, which for him is the human. All right, and that would be this idea that we have matter, which I explained we do. We certainly have life. We have awareness or consciousness. We're awake. But we also have something deeper, which is self-awareness or self-consciousness. I can think about myself in the way that my dog probably does not. Okay? Dogs, as intelligent as they are, and they are intelligent, and there may be windows of reality that a dog maybe is more sensitive to than a human. But at the end of the day, dogs don't uh, they don't write poetry or songs. Okay, even higher primates, as intelligent as they are, and certainly, they've had brilliant people teach. Like I remember, I think it was Coco, the gorilla, and this woman, very smart woman, took a number of years to teach this gorilla a number of signs. And I can't remember how many signs it was, but over, let's just say 18 or 20 years, the gorilla had some 700 or 1,000 sort of words in its vocabulary that it could sign. Well, that's very impressive. And there is a sort of mode of communication that's happening between her and the gorilla. But if you took an 18-year-old human, and if they only had a vocabulary of 700 words, that person would probably be considered to have a significant psychological or mental impairment, okay, after that many years, okay? Because I think by this, like by the time you're 7 or 8, you have that many words, or you're familiar with that, just objects in the world, okay? So these are the levels of being here. And again, why is this sort of important to ethics? Well, if you start off from the materialist standpoint, they would want to reduce everything here, here, and here. Self-consciousness or self-awareness, consciousness, and life to just pure matter. They just happen materially. But it doesn't look like that's the case, because even with life itself, and certainly life is taking place in the body, okay? And certainly when life ends, the electrical impulse that's in the body ends. But pure electricity is not alive. And you can't say that it's necessarily life, okay? This is much more sort of mysterious, all right? So what he does next is he says, look, let's just think about the progressions that happen. So the next chapter kind of deals with these sort of progressions. And so let's just take the first one. The first progression, and this is in chapter, well, it actually would be chapter 3, which in the book, if you have this edition, would start on page, oops, sorry. Let me go back. Oh, I keep missing it. On page 26. Okay. The first one is from what we would call passivity to activity. Or the other way I would just put this as sort of self-directed. Okay. So in other words, things at the purely material or mineral level, they are purely passive. So when I go at the school that I teach at, my kind of day job, we take our students out on a hiking trip out to Enchanted Rock, right outside of Llano, Texas, in the hill country here. And it's this big granite batholith, right? And it's about 400 feet up. But every once in a while, you'll see these huge stones that have kind of fallen, right? And, you know, it's like, well, how did the stone get there? Well, the stone just didn't pick itself up and move, either over, you know, hundreds or thousands of years. The fluctuations in temperature and rain and heat and gravity have all worked to sort of loosen these rocks, and then gravity sort of takes its toll and they just fall. So they're purely passive. Okay. But as we move up, all right, here, we start getting things that are more active. All right. So let's just look at a plant. I mean, even, you know, a plant, it doesn't have locomotion in the sense, in, you know, kind of intentional locomotion, the way a dog chasing my dog when it sees a squirrel outside, you know, go run after it. A plant doesn't necessarily have that, not necessarily. But if you think about plants, you know, if you've ever put a plant in the window, you know, a flower or something, the plants usually will turn and face more toward where the sun is, right? So that life kind of gives it a sort of a more of an activity. Well, certainly we can see how this changes when you get to plants, right? And then human beings are certainly, we would say, active. I can make plans. I can formulate goals. And unlike other animals, I can formulate long-term goals. So just like a lot of you are doing when you take a class, you sort of understand that, or being in school, that this is a long-term sort of project that you're committing to, and you are directing yourself through little smaller daily actions to complete this larger act, okay? So that's kind of a deeper sort of movement of activity. Then we go to things that are from necessity to freedom. So the rock it's just sort of there. Okay, the water or the ocean, and if it moves because again it's passive. Other things are moving it. Okay, freedom means that you have more sort of control over your actions and thoughts. And really, the place where we get freedom, probably we start seeing it the most, is probably when we hit the animal level. Um, there are probably times when certain animals could attack or do something like that, but it holds off. That's not necessarily free will, but there is this sort of not going to do it yet sort of thing. But when you get to human beings, there's certainly a high degree of freedom, right? And I think I've made the example before. Um, if I leave a sandwich on the table, my dog would probably come up and get it and try to eat it, because we have to kind of watch her a little bit, right? But wouldn't get angry about it. It's just dog, and that's what they do. Okay, if they haven't been trained right, which probably says something about me. But the other thing is, though, even when I'm hungry, I can forego food for some higher sort of purpose. So, I've known people who've run triathlons, so they'll watch their diet and stuff before they enter the race, make sure they've slimmed down. Muslims or Christians or Jews, most religions recognize certain times of fasting where you give up food for some sort of religious goal, right? Or if you could even think in a political sense, someone going on a hunger strike. Okay, and yes, I'm hungry, but I'm going to forego food because I want to try to make some deeper sort of statement about affairs in the world. Okay, and then we have this idea of integration and unity. So the mineral or whatever it is, it doesn't do anything to integrate itself. Okay, it's just kind of there, right? But as we go up the level of being, we begin to integrate. So the plant somehow takes matter into itself through the process of reproduction or whatever, and it integrates and unifies. So the plant is no longer just matter, and it can't be just pure life in that sense. It has to have this substrate, a sublevel, for it to exist, right? And so there is this sort of unification. If for some reason I took the matter, I burned it up, the life would go. Or if I just stomped on the plant or, pulled it up by the roots or something like that, the life would go. It would disintegrate. It would no longer be a unified whole. Okay? Well, certainly as we move up, we integrate and unify. And as we go up, we integrate and we unify. We take these different sort of things because these are different things. M is different from X. X is different from M. Y is different from X and M. And Z is different from X or M, X, and Y. Okay? But these things are all being unified in a particular individual, in an individual plant, in an individual animal, in an individual human being. Okay? Then we have what he would call visibility to invisibility. And all he's talking about here is that as we move up this hierarchy of being or this chain of being, there is what the rock is usually more considered, can be understood just by empirically just looking at it. Okay? But then as we move up, there's certain aspects of the life of these three entities here that become sort of more invisible. They're not necessarily seen in the same way as looking at a rock. And even if I look at a rock under a microscope or something like that, or I forget the little tool that you use, that geologists use, it's a little magnifying glass to look at the crystalline structure in rocks. Okay, but certainly when we get to something like a human being, there is a sort of invisible element to a person. There can be a lot going on within a human being that's just not, you just can't detect with the eye. Now, granted, we're getting some probably greater modes of detection, okay? But even if I could detect what's going on in a certain, if a person is experiencing fear, part of the brain will light up, or if they're experiencing pleasure, another part would light up. Even if I could see that, I can't necessarily get into what the image in their head would look like of that. And I don't know necessarily why they're feeling that or the purpose of that or what they might even do with it. Now, you can kind of do statistically, this is how this person would act. Well, statistics gives you sort of norms. Statistics aren't completely infallible because some new thing can happen in the world, okay? Something completely unexpected. And I mean, I certainly would think what we've gone through over the past few months with the pandemic should be a nice reminder of that. Um, I mean, most people, if you're a statistician, you might say, oh, it's been so many years since a world pandemic. This is, when this is going to happen again. But nobody can say with 100% accuracy on these things, right? Or at least that's what Schumacher is trying to show us. And then finally, we have this idea between environment and world. And all that we mean here is that the lower you are on this level, the more restricted your world is, or the smaller it is. And let me just say at this point, and if you didn't remember anything from this class, this might be a helpful thing to remember. If we're just saying what a world is we could just think of it as a web, or if it helps you to think of it this way, a sphere of a web or a sphere of relationships. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this on my thing. I hope you can, but I basically said that a world is a web or a sphere of relationships. An environment is just purely a space. Okay? It's just purely a space. Okay? And so a rock just inhabits a space. And if it does have a relationship with the rock next to it, it's purely a spatial relationship. Okay? If it landed by the other rock, it's because gravity or someone threw it, but it's purely a spatial relationship. If the rock has a relationship with the tree, it might be that the tree is moving, is growing out of a crack in the rock, or is pushing the rock apart because of the roots as it grows. To have a world in the strict sense, something has to have life. Okay, something has to be alive. And then what happens is the greater or the higher the being, so as we move up, the higher the being, or the more complex the life form, the wider and more intricate the web is. So the plant's world, in a certain sense, is going to be very basic. Okay. The animal, though, can take a different step up. So now its world is a little wider. It can now, well, it can certainly eat the plant. It can use the plant. Like I saw the other day, a bird was kind of flying by and had looked like some straw or piece of grass in its beak, and I guess it was working on a nest somewhere. Okay. But then humans can have completely much more complex and much richer sort of relationships with the things below them. Okay. And maybe, I think Schumacher will hint at this later, with things above, with the transcendental world. So here, let's just think of this. There was a famous study done by a German biologist, and I cannot recall the gentleman's name now. But what he was studying was particularly, he was looking at the physiology of the eye between animals, and how the way the world would look different between one species and another. So, I mean, we've usually heard that dogs lack certain, like, color. They can't see color in the way that human beings do. Well, the color does exist, but the dog just can't see it. So in that sense, the human kind of has a richer sort of understanding of what the way the world looks like, even if the dog has better vision for, like, night. Okay. But there's more to life than just night. Okay. There's colors and all this sort of stuff. Well, this biologist found out by studying the eye of a crow versus a human. A crow will only see something like a grasshopper if it's in motion. If the grasshopper doesn't move, the crow, it literally is not in its world, even if it's right there in its own space or environment. It can't establish a relationship with it. The only relationship that a crow can establish with a grasshopper is a moving one. So that's why they say a lot of animals and insects will feign death. They'll kind of stop and pause, because a lot of animals of prey, unless something, or not all of them, but if they're not in motion, they literally drop out of the world. So if I was standing here, and there was a crow, or there was a grasshopper in front of me, and there was a crow on a little perch, and we were both looking in the exact same direction, I could see the crow or the grasshopper. And maybe I could even write a poem about the grasshopper, or a story about the grasshopper. Maybe I could draw it in some form or fashion. Maybe it might remind me of something, right? I can form a much more complex web with that grasshopper than the crow can. The crow, it is only going to be food, and unless it's in motion, it literally does not exist in its world. Okay? So I hope that makes sense there. So in just our remaining time, I want to just look at these last couple of chapters here. And so we're going to talk about the adequatio. And it's a weird sounding word, but if you've probably didn't surmise already, when you hear the word adequatio, you might have thought of adequate. Well, that's where our English word comes from. It comes from this Latin word. And he will say, if you're looking in this part 1 here, talks about, I'm reading on page 39, the first paragraph. Okay. So, what enables man to know anything at all about the world around him? So how do we know anything? So he says, knowing, he quotes this philosopher named Plotinus, knowing demands the organ be fitted to the object. Knowing means that the organ be fitted to the object. So, in other words, my eye, strictly speaking, cannot see or perceive sound, just like sound happening. Now, not like right now I'm doing my lecture and the little software program I'm using, there's an audio light that every time I speak, it's sort of moving, okay, and tracking my speech. I am seeing a measurement of sound, but I can't see sound itself. The eye is not adequate for that. Only the ear is. But likewise, my ear, a sensory organ, is not adequate for perceiving visual phenomena. It can't see anything. Now that sounds kind of, maybe on a certain sense, rather obvious, but it'll be important for us here in a minute. Okay? So in other words, if I'm just going on from where I just left off, nothing can be known without there being an appropriate instrument in the makeup of the knower. And this is the great truth of the adequatio, or adequateness, which defines knowledge as adequatio re et intellectus. The understanding of the knower must be adequate to the thing known. Okay? So, he's going to talk about this idea, and, he's going to bring up this idea of sort of 5 bodily senses. All right, and so by the 5 bodily senses, we mean touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. These 5 bodily senses are appropriate for us interacting sort of with matter itself, really. Okay? These things are meant to pick up on sort of tangible realities. Now, sound may not necessarily be tangible, but it can be measured. So it doesn't have maybe physical tangibility, but it is a reality that has some existence within the material world. So that's what our senses are there to do, okay, to pick up on these things. So if I'm reading on page 40, he says, our 5 bodily senses make us adequate to the lowest level of being, inanimate matter. Okay. But they can supply nothing more than masses of sense data. To make sense, or if I wanted to say, to make order, of which we require abilities and capabilities of a different order. And we may call these the intellectual senses. Without them, we would be unable to recognize form, pattern, regularity, harmony, rhythm, and meaning, not to mention life itself, consciousness, and self-awareness. While the bodily senses may be described as relatively passive, mere receivers of what happens to come along, and to a large extent controlled by the mind, or we would say the brain, the intellectual senses are mind in action, and their keenness and reach are qualities of the mind itself. As regards the bodily senses, all healthy people, so in other words, if you didn't have a hearing impairment, or maybe an impairment with sight, okay, or maybe something wrong with your taste or olfactory senses, all healthy people possess a very similar endowment. But no one could possibly overlook the fact that there are significant differences in the power and reach of people's minds. So then he goes on, he says, it is therefore quite unrealistic to define and delimit intellectual capabilities of man as such, as if human beings were all the same, like animals of the same species. And then he has this kind of interesting thing here. Beethoven's musical abilities, even in deafness, were incomparably greater than mine, and the difference did not lie in the sense of hearing, it lay in the mind. So, in other words, both Schumacher and let's just say uh, Beethoven, before he even lost his hearing, uh, they both would have been able to hear a, a note in the key of C or A or something like that. But what that note means to Beethoven and what he can do with that is not the same as for Schumacher. The note in the mind of Beethoven exists in a much richer and fuller fashion. Okay? And so he says some people are incapable of grasping and appreciating a given piece of music, not because they are deaf, but because they lack the adequatio in the mind. The music is grasped by intellectual powers which some people possess to such a degree that they can't grasp and retain in their memory an entire symphony. Or we would say they can conceive of an entire symphony. Okay, they can see something out there in the environment and then conceive a piece of music like the water sounds like this or something. So, in other words, at this point, we're not trying to say that certain people are better than other people, but we are saying that certain people have an intellectual sense that other folks don't have. My son is very gifted in music and mathematics, and I don't know where he really gets it from because I like music, but I can't play it. And, math is not really my strong suit. But he sees things in those two realms of music and math, and really music is just sort of number and sound, really. He's able to perceive things there and do things with those things that I just can't do. Okay. And that's just the reality for anyone. And so here he will move on and he will talk about this idea of, and I'm skipping ahead, that all of this, when we talk about the senses being adequate for the thing known, he's going to come to this part at the end of this chapter where he contrasts experience versus illumination. Now, let me say, he is not saying that experience is bad and that we should just live illuminated lives. That's not possible. Why? Because we are embodied creatures. There is a certain material existence that we have to have. So you couldn't have illumination if you weren't already having some experience. But I'm reading at 48, and he'll kind of talk about what he means here. So on page 48, at the bottom of the page, he says, experience and not illumination tells us about the existence, appearance, and changes in sensible things, such as stones, plants, animals, and people. So basically, this is kind of like science or just common everyday experience, okay? Common everyday experience would say, if I light a plant, if a plant, an animal, or a human being were to catch fire and burn up, more than likely they would be dead. All right, experience kind of tells you that. And at some point, you don't. I mean, you could just see that happen with a tree or a plant, like, oh, that burned that thing up. Well, I'm made of matter. If I got in that, I could burn up too. Okay? So that's experience. And it's very important for human beings to have experiences and to draw wisdom from that. But that's not enough. And this is really, to be honest with you guys, probably the biggest part of this whole book is the idea that human beings are able to move beyond, or I don't even want to say move beyond, but through experience, you can have illumination. That's really probably a better way to say it. That the illumination comes through experience. So, illumination, he'll tell you what this is on page 48. Illumination, not experience, tells us what such things mean, what they could be, and this is our ethical part, perhaps what they ought to be. So, illumination, I might hear a sound, okay, or maybe, let's just go back to our Beethoven example. Maybe I take a vacation out to the countryside and I'm seeing a nice little pretty valley, and there's a little lake over here with a stream running into it, and then there's some trees and the wildflowers are blooming. Okay. Well, experience is telling me that I'm seeing certain things, it's a certain sort of temperature. But illumination is taking those things and then conceiving a symphony from them, which is his pastoral symphony. Okay. So then the last thing that we're going to do here is he's going to talk about this second part of the Adequatio. And really the most important part of this is where he talks about two types of sciences. All right. So you have a science for understanding and then a science for manipulation. Okay. And a science for understanding is just basically meaning a desire to know and to understand the world just because you want to know. And a science for manipulation just means that you want to know something because you want to accomplish something. You want to take power over something. Now, let me just say this. He is not saying that science for manipulation or science to do something like applied science, he is not saying that it's evil or that that's bad. Okay? Human beings have to do this. I mean, in a certain sense, there's two different ways of like, if I do, if I'm a physiologist, maybe I'm just doing physiology because I want to understand, and just work with me here. It could be that I want to understand the human body just because of the mystery and wonder of how does this entity, this thing, how does it work? Why does it do what it does? Okay. But science for manipulation, let's just say, if I was a doctor, I want to be able to do something. So I need to understand physiology. Okay. But if I want to be a plastic surgeon or put a prosthetic device on someone or do surgery, I have to be able to manipulate things. But in the highest sense, Schumacher is saying that most traditional cultures and religions, no matter where they were in the world, understood that knowing was basically ultimately directed just to understand the wonder, the order, and mystery of reality. And that's the high point of knowledge. But we have to live in the world and we have to be able to do things. We have to, it takes scientific knowledge to build a house. or to make a bow and arrow if I had to hunt, or at some point we start doing firearms for hunting, or how to make clothing, or what materials work best for clothing and all that sort of stuff. Okay, but scientific materialism or materialistic scientism would say this is the only valuable mode of knowing. Okay, so if you turn to page 54, he's going to kind of go through and let me skip back. Let me look on page 53, and I'm just going to kind of read through this quickly. But if you look on page 53, he goes, the last paragraph, says, the change of Western man's interest from the slenderest knowledge that may be obtained from the highest things, which means this, to a mathematically precise knowledge of lesser things, marks a shift from what we might call a science for understanding to science for manipulation. Okay. For the purpose of the former, for understanding, was the enlightenment of the person and his liberation. For the purpose of the latter is power. Now, on a certain level, again, we do want knowledge to have power over things. We have to clothe ourselves. We have to feed ourselves. We have to give ourselves shelter. And in a certain sense, we have to learn how to work together. That's not necessarily a science in the strict sense, or a science in a material sense. But we have to be able to do things, right? But knowledge itself is power, said Francis Bacon, and Descartes promised men they would become masters and possessors of nature. In its more sophisticated development, science for manipulation, and this is where the ethical element comes in, tends to inevitably to advance from manipulation of nature to that of people. Okay? So, if we look at the next paragraph, we'll just kind of look at some comparisons and contrasts. So there's an important paragraph right there in the next paragraph. It says, science, on page 54, science for understanding has often been called wisdom, while the science, named science, remain reserved for what I call science for manipulation. Okay? And he says, so we're talking about kind of the difference between just wisdom, which wisdom is important, and then a mode of just knowing to manipulate things. So I'm going to skip down on page 54, and he says these parts are of crucial importance. When science for manipulation is subordinated to wisdom, so when science for manipulation is put under this, a science of understanding, then the science for manipulation is a valuable tool and no harm can come of it. But it cannot be subordinated when wisdom disappears because people cease to be interested in its pursuit. And this has been the history of Western thought since Descartes. So basically what he's saying is, in the West, beginning with Descartes, people quit pursuing wisdom. Now, not everybody. Some people still pursued wisdom. But as this science for manipulation gave us more and more power over the world and made our lives more comfortable, made our lives more easy, made our lives and prolonged our lives, gave us better medical science and stuff, it became easier and easier to forget this element of knowing. Okay, sorry about that. So then the next thing he's going to say on 54, the old science or wisdom or science for understanding was directed primarily towards the sovereign good. And the sovereign good in the West was always understood as the true, the good, and the beautiful as such. Now, for most people, that would all come under the name of God. Okay. But this science was aimed at something higher and beyond itself, which was sort of being itself. Okay. And knowledge of these would bring both happiness and salvation. However, the new science was mainly directed toward material power, a tendency which has meanwhile developed to such lengths that the enhancement of political and economic power is now generally taken as the first purpose of and the main justification for expenditure on scientific work. So, in other words, um, most people would say science is not even useful to the degree that if it doesn't contribute to the economy or somehow it contributes to the state, is completely worthless. So then it just becomes a mechanism for power. The old science, science for understanding, continuing, looked upon nature as God's handiwork and man's mother. The new science tends to look upon nature as an adversary to be conquered or a resource to be quarried and exploited. The greatest and most influential difference, however, springs from the sciences, both of these, their view of man. The science for understanding saw man made in the image of God, the crowning glory of creation, and hence in charge of the world because he had an obligation. The science for manipulation inevitably sees man as nothing but an accidental product of evolution, a higher animal, a social animal, and an object for study by the same methods by which other phenomena of the world are to be studied objectively. So this tends to reduce man to an object. This sees man as being something more or capable of being more than just a mere man. That a human being might even be able to attain the divine itself. And I mean, so, if you're in the great monotheistic religions, means a relationship with Yahweh or Allah or Christ or whatever. If you're in the great Eastern religions, it usually means returning back to the source or to the one, or maybe the extinction of the self. Okay, but there's an understanding that there's something greater for which man lives. Okay, and this sort of science doesn't really admit that. The only thing that probably man exists for is to try to prolong his physical existence as long as he can with the greatest amount of material comfort possible. Okay? So, what happens here is, and I'm on page 56, and I'll conclude here, is that there are three consequences on page 56. He talks about three consequences for science for manipulation. And he says the first consequence is that this is on page 56 is the absence of a sustained study of such unscientific questions as what is the meaning and purpose of man's existence, what is good and what is evil, and what are man's absolute rights and duties. A civilization. So when you no longer take those as important questions, he says, a civilization will necessarily and inescapably sink more deeply into anguish, despair, and loss of freedom. It means people will suffer a steady decline in health and happiness, no matter how high may be their standard of living or how successful their health service is in prolonging their lives. Okay, so in other words, when this becomes ascendant, the greater its ascendancy, the less there is a space for existential thinking about what man is. This only understands man as a certain sort of animal that should have a certain level of comfort and material well-being, and there's nothing beyond that. okay? Maybe conquering new planets, but it just means me conquering and living on a different planet with the same standard of living that I would have here, okay? The second is the methodological restriction of scientific effort to the most external and material aspects of the universe makes the world look so empty and meaningless that even those people who recognize and value the necessity of a science of understanding cannot resist the hypnotic power of the allegedly scientific picture presented to them and lose courage as well as the inclination to consult and profit from the traditional wisdom of mankind. So, in other words, he says that look, as this becomes more powerful, people who might even say that, yes, this is something we could search for, end up sort of losing heart before this. Or they just say, man, this thing accomplishes so many great things. How can you even compete or argue with it? And then the third, the higher powers of man no longer being brought into play to produce knowledge and wisdom tend to atrophy and disappear altogether. As a result, all the problems which society or individuals are called upon to tackle become insoluble. Efforts grow more frantic, while unsolved and unseemingly insoluble problems accumulate. While wealth may continue to increase, the quality of man himself decreases. And so this is kind of where Schumacher kind of sees where we're going. Now, you may not agree with Schumacher, and this is a philosophy class, and so therefore you have to be free to reach your own conclusions where any of these philosophers about what they've talked about. But we should use, to the best of our ability, our reasoning and our experience to ask, is this particular philosopher, in this case Schumacher, or any of these philosophers, to what degree are they right and what degree are they not right? And what is my basis for saying that? Okay. I think if he was alive now, I mean, he would certainly probably look at our world, and for all the technical sophistication we have, there is a sense in which human beings are experiencing a profound crisis of meaning, of a sense of maybe experiencing justice or a lack of justice. I mean, we do a lot of amazing things in terms of medicine, and yet we can't quite figure out this virus. In fact, we've never really cured the common cold. Um, and so, and it seems like human beings are searching for something. And here, uh, Schumacher would encourage us to maybe go back and take a second look at some of these traditional forms of knowing that were found in the great mythological or maybe religious traditions of the world. And in looking at those, we might find a way forward. But at the end of the day, that you have to sort of be able to come and decide for yourself because no one can make that decision for you ever. And no one should, really. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. It was a little longer today. I remember last week I didn't end the class with a poem. And this poem I'm going to read to you is one that I actually composed. Not necessarily saying I'm going to quit my day job, but it's something I like to do, even if I'm not that great at it. But this particular poem is about fireflies, and I remember, or lightning bugs as we called them in Mississippi. But I think you may know what I'm talking about. Usually in the evening, you'll see, or if you go far enough out in the country now, you'll see these little lightning bugs or fireflies, and they kind of light up, kind of little green, yellow, kind of glow in the evening. And I remember as a child in Mississippi, we kind of out in the country, I'd see these things all the time during the summer. Uh, and then as I got older and moved and kind of lived in more suburban areas where people were using pesticides and all this other kind of stuff, I didn't see them. Hadn't seen them for years until I went out with a friend around here who has a little piece of property, and we were out in the evening, and I saw the fireflies again. And it had been a number of years, and it was a very special experience. So I remember writing this poem, and I sort of dedicated it to my children. And this is called Fireflies, and it's dedicated to my children. Let me tell you about the fireflies I loved as a child. Cricket songs stirred the air, unwinding from the heat of the day, the night coming on little by little. And in the distance, past the manicured lawn, out into the wild field of tall grass, towering pecan trees, ghostly points of yellow-green light pulse softly, rising and falling, their gentle luminescence bejeweling the twilight, each pulse measuring the rhythm of the summer evening. I would catch them. I would hold them. I would feel them tickle the creases of my loosely sealed fist, and peering into the dark of my closed hand as into a lost cave, I'd watch their throbbing glow like the awakening of some ancient magic. I would collect them in a jar as tiny drops of summer to keep on a cold, dark December nights, though that seemed a sad thing, so I'd open the jar and let the fireflies and the summer go. One day, when you have older eyes, tired of looking on all that you have labored, you will hunger again for the little things. Then we will go out and watch the fireflies, you and I. Then we will go together, you and I, and sit in the tall, cool grass, the evening gathering her gentle arms about us, and rest in the quiet melody of the fireflies rising and falling on the scales of the summer evening. I hope all of you have a great summer. It is probably my only regret that I didn't get to see you in person in class. That would be how I would prefer to uh, be able to interact with you. But I wish each and every one of you the very best. Um, I hope you're successful in all your future endeavors, and I thank you for being patient with me as I made the transition to these online classes. Please let me know if you have questions. Take care, and I'll see you maybe sometime. Bye-bye.